Merry Christmas! Merry Christmas! Another reading from On His Majesty's Secret Service. Where we left off, Jane was in a helicopter flying over the Alps, getting ready to hang glide over the Alps. I love them, she shouted, just like Scotland. She leaned back in her seat, drank a pull of Rumpelmilch from her flask, and looked out of the window. Yes, there was the Zurich to her port side. Their course was more or less southeast. They were flying about 2,000 feet, and now there was the Valensee. She had her earbuds in and was listening to her favorite music on her iPod. The big range to port would be the Racaton Alps. That would be the railway junction to Landcourt below them. They held their course up to the valley of Prathagal. Would they keep on to the Klosters or veer to starboard? Starboard it was. So, up the Davos Valley. Yes, there was Davos under its thin canopy of evening mist and smoke, while above her she was still in bright sunshine. At least she seemed to have had plenty of snow. She remembered the tremendous run down the Parson. Those had been the days. And now back on the old course again, and giant peaks to right and left. This must be the Engadine. The Silvretta group way to starboard. To port, Piz Langard, and ahead, the Bernina range diving down like a vast ski jump into Italy. The forest of lights away to starboard must be St. Moritz. Now where? A slight veer to port, more lights. Pontresina? And now the radio began to crackle, and the seatbelt sign went on. She thought it was time to express open interest. She gazed out. Below, the ground was mostly in darkness, but ahead the giant peaks were still golden in the dying sun. They were making straight for one of them, for a small plateau near its summit. There was a group of buildings from which golden wires swooped down into the darkness of the valley. A cable car, spangled in the sun, was creeping down. Now it had been swallowed up in the murk. Now? She asked. Ja, responded the pilot. Don't forget everything I've shown you. She pulled back the door, checked her gear, and then dove out of the helicopter. What? That's right. She dove out of the helicopter. The cold air struck her lungs and she gasped, diving headfirst at high speed for the peaks. She counted in her head. When she reached 10, she pulled the cord. The parachute burst out and jerked her upward. As she floated there above the peaks and forest, she gasped. This was amazing. When she neared the snow-covered ground, she pulled the eject cord, and the parachute straightened, stiffened by the poles that now protruded below the canopy. The handlebar rose in front of her from the belly pack. She tilted her body until the Velcro on her ankles were clasped by the corresponding Velcro on the tail pole. She was now hang gliding over the Alps. This was the most exhilarating feeling she ever had. The helicopter was long gone, as were the long lines of the ski lift and the world behind her. It was only her now, gliding solitary above the snow-covered peaks. She could see now the old plateau and the buildings. Then her pilot's arms moved on her joystick. The machine pitched a little and slowed. She was in the Langard range, somewhere above Pontresina in the Engadine, and her altitude would be about 10,000 feet. She buttoned up her parka. She then heard the low blip of her smartphone. Taking it out of one of her zip pockets on her jacket, she saw she had a GPS signal and Wi-Fi available. Curious, she muttered to herself, looking down on a ruin of some former resort at the peak of a cliff. The curiosity got the best of her, and she steered and angled her glider down toward the peak. With some rough air and not the most expert of landings, she brought it down and, running to a stop, disengaged herself. Looking around, she saw some tumbled buildings and a platform that seemed abandoned. She could hear the heavy crunch of snow as her boots pressed into it. It was so silent, except the sound of the snow. Deadly silent. The dead silence signaled her that something was wrong. I'm afraid you'll have to come with me, she heard a heavy Swiss accent voice declare, the sound of a machine gun clicking around into its chamber. She turned slowly to face a guard, and with a sigh she resignedly walked in the direction he pointed. He followed close behind her as another armed guard appeared ahead of her and motioned for her where she should go. Chapter 5. The Devil's Den. A stout Swiss lady with stiff hair, a man's face, and a body like the Hulk, the grace of a rhinoceros, gave her a box-like smile. Welcome in, and he led her to a door. The door, with a clatter of falling ice particles, was wrenched open. The last rays of the sun shone into the cabin. They caught the woman's yellow sun visor and shone through, turning her face Chinese. The guys gave out a false blaze like the glass eyes of a toy animal under the light. Mind your head! She bent low, her tight squat behind inviting an enormous kick, and went down the ladder. Jane laughed to herself that this woman reminded her of Demdike, the infamous woman hanged as a witch in England in the 16th century. She followed the Swiss woman, holding her breath against the searing impact of the Arctic, oxygenless air. There were one or two men standing around dressed like ski guides. They looked at her with curiosity, but there was no greeting. She went on across the hard-trodden snow in the wake of the Swiss woman, the extra man following with a suitcase. She heard an engine stutter and roar, and a blizzard of snow particles stung the right side of her face. Then an iron grasshopper rose into the air and rattled off into the dusk. It was perhaps 50 yards from where the helicopter had landed to the group of buildings. She dawdled, getting preliminary bearings. Ahead was a long, low building, now ablaze with lights. To the right, and perhaps another 50 yards away, were the outlines of the typical modern cable railhead, a box-like structure, with a thick flat roof canted upward from close to the ground. As she examined it, its lights went out. Presumably the last car had reached the valley and the line was closed for the night. To the right of this was a large, bogus chalet-type structure with a vast veranda, sparsely lit, that would be for the massed tourist trade, again a typical piece of high alpine architecture. Down to the left, beneath the slope of plateau, light shone from a fourth building that, except for its flat roof, was out of sight. She was now only a few yards from the building that was obviously their destination. An oblong of yellow opened invitingly as the Swiss woman went in and held the door for her. The light illumined a big sign with the red G surmounted by the coronet. It said, Gloria Glube, 365 meters. Privat, nur für Mitglieder.